In the sprawling landscape of 1980s America, few stories captivated and horrified the nation, quite like the rise and fall of Rajneeshpuram, the city built by thousands of red-robed followers in the high desert of Oregon. At the center of that story stood Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh, the enigmatic Indian mystic who collected 93 Rolls-Royces and preached a gospel of free love and spiritual enlightenment. But behind the silent guru, behind the flowing white beard and the penetrating gaze that seemed to see straight through to the soul, stood a woman whose fierce devotion and ruthless pragmatism built an empire in the wilderness and then watched it crumble to dust. Her name was Ma Anand Sheela, and for nearly a decade, she was the voice, the fist, and the iron will of a movement that would culminate in the largest bioterror attack on American soil. As she once said, with characteristic defiance during a television interview, her dark eyes flashing with barely contained fury, "I'm a street fighter. I can fight in any situation. I am here to protect Bhagwan and his people, and I will do whatever it takes." Her story, one of devotion twisted into domination, of love calcified into control, deserves to be understood not simply as the tale of a cult's collapse, but as the portrait of a woman who believed she was building paradise and instead created a prison. This is not just the history of Rajneeshpuram. This is the story of Sheela Ambalal Patel, the girl from Baroda who became Ma Anand Sheela, and how a woman's unwavering loyalty to a silent master led her to orchestrate crimes that would land her in a federal penitentiary and leave her name etched in infamy. Born Sheela Ambalal Patel on December 28, 1949, in the bustling city of Baroda in Gujarat state, India, Sheela grew up in a household shaped by Gandhian ideals and traditional Indian values. She was the youngest of 6 children, born to Ambalal and Maniben Patel, a couple who belonged to the Gujarati merchant class and who instilled in their children a sense of discipline, education, and moral duty. Baroda in the 1950s was a city of contrasts, a place where colonial-era buildings with their pale yellow facades and wrought-iron balconies stood alongside ancient Jain temples with intricate carvings that told stories thousands of years old, where the scent of incense from morning prayers mixed with diesel fumes from ambassador taxis rattling through the narrow streets, where women in vibrant silk saris haggled with vegetable vendors in the crowded bazaars, while British-educated lawyers in pressed suits hurried to the courthouse. For young Sheela, a girl with dark, watchful eyes and a stubborn set to her jaw, growing up in this environment meant navigating the expectations of a conservative family while harboring a restless ambition that would eventually carry her far from home. Those who knew her as a child remember a girl who was spirited and quick to speak her mind, unafraid of confrontation even when it got her into trouble. She was not content to follow the path laid out for most young women of her background, a path that led from school to marriage to motherhood within the safe boundaries of community and caste. Instead, Sheela dreamed of something larger, something beyond the confines of Baroda's tree-lined boulevards and her father's jewelry business, though at the time she could not have imagined just how far that dream would take her. The Patel household was one of relative comfort, but also of rigid expectations. Ambalal Patel ran a successful jewelry business, and the family lived in a 2-story house in one of Baroda's better neighborhoods, with a small garden where Sheela's mother grew jasmine and roses. But comfort did not mean freedom. Sheila's older sisters were married off in their late teens to suitable boys from respectable families, and it was assumed that Sheela would follow the same path. She was expected to help her mother with household chores, to learn cooking and embroidery, to be modest and obedient. But Sheela chafed against these expectations. She argued with her father about why she should be allowed to attend university, why she should have the same opportunities as her brothers. She was, in the words of one of her sisters in an interview years later, always fighting, always questioning, always making trouble. But she was also bright, earning top marks in school, and eventually her father relented. At 18, in 1967, Sheela made a decision that was both bold and uncommon for a young Indian woman of that era. She would leave India and travel to the United States to pursue higher education. Her father, perhaps hoping that the experience would settle her down, agreed to pay for her studies. And so, in the late summer of 1967, Sheela boarded an Air India flight from Bombay to New York, carrying a single suitcase and a head full of dreams. America in the late 1960s was a country in upheaval, a place where young people were questioning authority, experimenting with consciousness, and searching for meaning in a world that seemed to be coming apart at the seams. The Vietnam War raged on, protesters filled the streets, and the counterculture movement promised liberation from the stifling conformity of the previous decade. For Sheela, stepping off the plane at John F. Kennedy International Airport on a humid August afternoon, the shock of arriving in this different universe was immediate and overwhelming. The cold blast of air conditioning in the terminal, the fast-paced English spoken all around her, the sheer size of everything, the cars, the buildings, the highways, the freedom she saw in the way American women dressed and moved through the world, in their short skirts and bare arms, their loud laughter and confident strides. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. She took a bus to New Jersey, where she had enrolled at Montclair State College to study sociology, and she moved into a dormitory room that she shared with two American girls who looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and polite indifference. For the first few weeks, Sheela felt utterly alone. She struggled with the language, with the food, with the casual way people interacted. But she was determined not to fail, not to go back to Baroda having accomplished nothing. She threw herself into her studies, spending long hours in the library, and gradually she began to find her footing. It was during her second semester, in the spring of 1968, that Sheela met Mark Harris Silverman. Mark was a 21-year-old aspiring physicist from Highland Park, Illinois, a thoughtful, gentle young man with wire-rimmed glasses and soft brown hair that fell across his forehead. He had a smile that made Sheela feel, for the first time since arriving in America, truly seen. They met in the college library, both reaching for the same sociology textbook on a crowded shelf. Mark pulled it down and handed it to her with a slight bow, a gesture that made her laugh. They started talking, and what began as a conversation about Max Weber's theories on bureaucracy somehow turned into a 3-hour discussion about everything: family, religion, the meaning of life, whether hamburgers were better than dosas. Mark had a way of listening that made Sheela feel like her words mattered, like her thoughts were worth hearing. They started meeting for coffee, then for lunch, then for long walks around campus. Sheela found herself falling for him, hard and fast, in a way she had never experienced before. But Mark carried a secret, and when he finally told her, sitting across from her in a dimly lit booth at a diner on Main Street, his hands trembling as he stirred sugar into his coffee, the words landed like stones. He had Hodgkin's disease, a form of lymphatic cancer. He'd been diagnosed at 18, just before starting college, and the doctors had given him 1.5 years to live. That had been 3 years ago. He'd undergone chemotherapy, radiation, the works, and he was in remission, but the doctors had made it clear that the cancer could come back at any time. "I didn't want to tell you," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes fixed on the table between them. "I didn't think it was fair. I don't want to be someone's burden. I don't want you to feel like you have to take care of me." That Sheela looked at him, at the way the fluorescent lights from the diner's sign outside caught the fear and vulnerability in his eyes, at the way his shoulders hunched, as if he were trying to make himself smaller, and she made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. She reached across the table and took his hands in hers. "Then don't be a burden," she said, her voice fierce with a certainty she didn't entirely feel. "Be my husband. Be my partner. Let's face whatever comes together." They married on June 20th, 1960, in a small ceremony held in the backyard of Mark's parents' house in Highland Park. Sheela wore a simple white dress she'd bought at a second-hand shop on Main Street in Montclair, and Mark wore the only suit he owned, a dark blue number that was slightly too big in the shoulders. There were about 20 people in attendance, mostly Mark's family and a handful of friends from college. Sheila's family did not attend. Her father, when she had called to tell him about the engagement, had been furious. She was marrying an American, a non-Hindu, a man with a death sentence hanging over him. It was a betrayal of everything the family stood for. "You are no longer my daughter," he had told her before hanging up the phone. The words had cut deeper than Sheela wanted to admit, but she pushed the pain aside. She had made her choice. She and Mark exchanged vows under a canopy of oak trees, their voices shaking with emotion. And when the rabbi pronounced them husband and wife, Sheela felt a surge of hope. Maybe love could be enough. Maybe together they could beat the odds. For the next 3 years, Sheela and Mark lived together in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in Montclair, and Sheela learned what it meant to love someone who was dying. She learned to recognize the signs of a bad day, the way Mark's face would go pale and drawn, the way he'd wince and hold his side when the pain flared up in his abdomen. She learned to prepare meals that wouldn't trigger nausea, bland foods like rice and boiled chicken, avoiding anything too spicy or too rich. She learned to massage his feet when the neuropathy from the chemotherapy made them tingle and ache, to hold him in the middle of the night when the fear became too much and he would wake up gasping, convinced that this was it, that the cancer had come back. And she learned that love, real love, was not the fairy tale she'd imagined growing up, the Bollywood romance with dancing and singing and happy endings. It was showing up every single day. Even when you were exhausted, it was watching someone you loved suffer and not being able to fix it. It was the small moments, holding hands while watching television, laughing at stupid jokes, the way Mark would leave little notes for her on the bathroom mirror. Messages like, "You are amazing," and "I love you more than physics," and the way those notes could make her cry, even as they made her smile. By 1972, the toll of Mark's illness and the endless cycle of treatments and relapses had worn them both down. Mark's cancer had returned, and this time the chemotherapy was more aggressive, the side effects more brutal. He lost weight, his hair fell out in clumps, and there were days when he couldn't get out of bed. Sheela, working as a waitress at a local diner to make ends meet while Mark was too sick to work, felt like she was drowning. They were searching for something, anything, that might offer solace in the face of mortality. And it was Mark who first heard about Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh, an Indian mystic who had established an ashram in Pune, India. A friend from college had given him a cassette tape of one of Rajneesh's discourses, a rambling 2-hour talk about the nature of ego and the illusion of separateness, and Mark had listened to it late one night while Sheela slept beside him. The next morning he shook her awake, his eyes bright with something she hadn't seen in months. Hope. "We need to go to India," he said, his voice urgent. "I think this man might have answers. I think he might be able to help us." Sheela, exhausted and desperate and willing to try anything, agreed. They sold what little they owned, their second-hand furniture, Mark's collection of physics textbooks, the car they'd bought with their wedding gift money, and they packed 2 battered suitcases. In April 1972, they boarded a plane to Bombay. The ashram in Pune was nothing like what Sheela had expected. Nestled in the Koregaon Park neighborhood, a leafy enclave of old colonial bungalows and tree-lined streets, it was a sprawling complex of buildings with whitewashed walls and red tile roofs, surrounded by lush gardens filled with bougainvillea, frangipani, and hibiscus. The air smelled of incense and sandalwood, and everywhere she looked, there were people dressed in maroon robe and wooden mala necklaces with Rajneesh's photograph dangling from them. They called themselves sannyasins, and they moved through the ashram with a strange mixture of purpose and abandon, laughing loudly, touching each other freely, radiating a kind of joy that seemed almost manic. Sheela and Mark arrived in the middle of a dynamic meditation session, and the sight stopped them in their tracks. Hundreds of people stood in a large open courtyard, breathing heavily, shaking their bodies, screaming at the top of their lungs. It was chaos, primal and unnerving, and Sheela felt her first instinct was to turn around and leave. But Mark squeezed her hand and pulled her forward. Their first darshan with Rajneesh took place 2 days later in a small room called Chuang Tzu Auditorium. Sheela sat cross-legged on the floor, her heart pounding as Rajneesh entered. He was a small man, shorter than she'd imagined, with a flowing white beard and long hair, dressed in a simple white robe. But it was his eyes that held her. Dark and penetrating, they seemed to look straight through her, past all the defenses she'd built up, straight into the core of who she was. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost hypnotic, with a slight Indian accent that made every word sound like a secret being shared. "Welcome home," he said, looking directly at Sheela and Mark. And Sheela felt something inside her crack open, a dam breaking, and tears streamed down her face, though she couldn't have said why. Later, she would describe that moment in interviews, her voice still filled with wonder decades later, her eyes distant with memory. It was in this moment, if death were to have come, I would accept. My life was complete. I felt like I'd been searching for this my entire life and didn't even know it. Rajneesh gave her a new name, Ma Anand Sheela, which meant blissful. Mark became Swami Chinmaya, and just like that, with the exchange of names and the receiving of malas, they became part of the ashram, part of something larger than their own suffering. For the next 8 years, Sheela and Mark lived in Pune, and in many ways, despite the shadow of Mark's illness, those years were the happiest of Sheela's life. The ashram offered a refuge, a place where Mark's illness could be faced with acceptance rather than fear. There were no pitying looks, no whispered conversations about how long he had left. There was just life, lived fully, day by day. Sheela threw herself into the ashram's operations with the same fierce determination she'd brought to everything else in her life. She started working in the administrative offices, a small room in the Krishna House building that overlooked the gardens, and she discovered she had a gift for organization. She could look at a chaotic situation, a scheduling conflict, a budget shortfall, a dispute between residents, and she could see solutions that others missed. She was efficient, decisive, and she didn't suffer fools. If someone wasn't pulling their weight, she told them. If a system wasn't working, she fixed it. Rajneesh noticed. He began to rely on her more and more, giving her increasing responsibility. She managed finances, coordinated logistics for the thousands of visitors, who came to the ashram each year and dealt with the Indian government officials who were growing increasingly suspicious of the commune's activities. But the ashram years were also marked by profound personal pain. Mark's battle with Hodgkin's disease continued, a relentless enemy that kept returning no matter how hard they fought. He would have periods of remission, weeks or even months when he seemed almost healthy, when he could work in the ashram gardens or participate in the meditation sessions without collapsing from exhaustion. But then the cancer would come back, and he would be back in the hospital for another round of chemotherapy, another round of radiation, and Sheela would sit by his bedside in their small room in Krishna House, holding his hand as he drifted in and out of sleep. She would read to him from books of poetry, Rumi and Hafiz and Kabir, their words about love and longing and the dissolution of the self. Sometimes Mark would wake up confused, not recognizing where he was, his mind clouded by the drugs and the disease. Other times, he would wake up lucid and would smile at her, that same gentle smile that had made her fall in love with him all those years ago in the Montclair Library. And he would say things like, "I'm glad I didn't listen to my own advice. I'm glad I married you. These have been the best years of my life." And those moments made everything worth it, all the pain and the fear and the exhaustion. For 13 years, Mark had lived with Hodgkin's disease, longer than anyone had predicted, longer than seemed possible. But by the spring of 1980, it was clear that his body could not fight any longer. The cancer had spread to his bones, to his liver, and the doctors said there was nothing more they could do. On the night of June 11th, 1980, in their room in Krishna House, with the windows open to let in the warm Pune breeze that carried the scent of jasmine from the gardens, Mark took his last breath. Sheela was 30 years old, and the loss devastated her in ways she couldn't have anticipated. The ashram community, in an effort to help her through the grief, gave her tranquilizers that put her to sleep for 3 days. When she woke up, Mark's funeral had already taken place. There is footage from that funeral, grainy black and white film that shows Sheela standing among the sannyasins in the ashram courtyard, a garland of marigolds around her neck, smiling. But those who knew her could see the falseness in that smile, the mechanical way she moved, the emptiness in her eyes. She was covering up a sorrow so deep it threatened to swallow her whole. In interviews years later, sitting in her Swiss nursing home with the afternoon light streaming through the windows, Sheela would describe those years with Mark as living with a naked sword hanging over them. "We lived every day knowing it might be our last together," she said, her voice softening. "And when he died, I felt like that sword had finally fallen. But instead of killing me, it just left me empty, hollow." In the aftermath of Mark's death, Sheela did what she had always done when faced with unbearable pain. She poured herself into work. She became Rajneesh's personal secretary, the person who managed his schedule, handled his correspondence, and increasingly spoke for him. Rajneesh, whose health was also declining, suffering from chronic back pain, diabetes, and asthma, had begun to limit his public appearances and interactions with disciples. Sheela became the conduit between the guru and his followers, and with that role came power. In December 1980, just 6 months after Mark's death, she married another sannyasin, John Shelfer, in what seemed more a matter of convenience than love. Shelfer was an American disciple, quiet and devoted to Rajneesh, and the marriage appeared to be an arrangement to help with visa issues and ashram administration. Those close to Sheela say she never spoke about Shelfer with the tenderness she reserved for Mark's memory. But Sheila's real relationship, the one that came to define her life, was with Rajneesh himself. It was a relationship that defied easy categorization. Part devotion, part obsession, part love. Though whether it was romantic love or something else entirely remained a subject of speculation and gossip within the ashram. Sheela would later describe her feelings for Rajneesh in language that bordered on the erotic and the mystical. In a 2019 interview with a reporter from The Telegraph, her voice husky with memory, she said, "You should see some of the photographs and see how he looked at me, and the way he said, 'Sheela.' One divine evening we watched Umrao Jan together. There was poetry on love in it. He explained every word of that poetry to me. My relationship with Osho wasn't sexual. The integrity mattered because I was already drowning in him. There are no whys in love. It simply happens." When pressed about whether there had been a physical relationship, Sheela was adamant. There was no sex with Osho. Our relationship wasn't sexual. But the intensity of her devotion was undeniable, and it would drive everything she did in the years to come. By 1981, the ashram in Pune had become a source of increasing controversy in India. The Indian government, alarmed by the commune's growing influence, its flouting of traditional social norms, and its financial opacity, had begun to crack down. Tax authorities conducted raids on the ashram, seizing financial records and imposing heavy fines that the commune struggled to pay. Local residents, scandalized by the reports of free love, nudity in the therapy groups, and the general atmosphere of permissiveness that seemed to pervade the ashram, organized protests outside the gates, holding signs that read, "Immoral," and "Go home." The newspapers ran sensationalistic stories about the sex guru and his Western followers. Rajneesh's health, too, was declining, and the pollution in Pune aggravated his respiratory condition. He suffered from frequent asthma attacks that left him gasping for breath. It was clear to Sheela and to the other leaders of the ashram that they could not continue as they had been. Rajneesh needed a new home, a place where his movement could grow without interference from hostile governments and conservative neighbors. The question was where. It was Sheela who found the answer, and in doing so, set in motion the events that would lead to Rajneeshpuram and ultimately to her downfall. In the spring of 1981, she traveled to the United States with a small group of sannyasins, including her new husband John Shelfer and a handful of trusted disciples. They rented cars and drove across the American West, looking at properties in Colorado, New Mexico, and California. They visited ranches and farms, communes and retreat centers, but nothing felt right. Some were too small, others too expensive. Still others too close to cities and towns. Then, in early June 1981, they found it. The Big Muddy Ranch, a 64,000-acre expanse of high desert in Wasco County, Oregon, about 120 miles east of Portland. The property was remote, accessible only by a winding dirt road that snaked through canyons and sagebrush-covered hills, passing through the tiny town of Antelope, population 40. The landscape was harsh and beautiful in equal measure, with rust-colored rock formations, juniper trees twisted by the wind, and vistas that stretched for miles under endless blue skies. There was little water. The nearest river was miles away, and there were few structures beyond a couple of dilapidated ranch houses and some outbuildings. The land was considered by most to be worthless for anything but cattle grazing, and even that was marginal. But Sheela saw its potential. It was isolated, far from prying eyes and hostile governments. It was large enough to accommodate thousands of followers. And most importantly, it was available, being sold by its owner for $75 million, using funds pooled from wealthy sannyasins and fronted through a series of shell companies to avoid suspicion. Sheela purchased the ranch in June 1981. The deed was put in the name of the Chidvilas Corporation, a non-profit organization that gave no hint of its connection to Rajneesh or the ashram. Then, in a move that shocked both the Indian government and the ashram community in Pune, Sheela arranged for Rajneesh himself to be flown to the United States. On a medical visa, ostensibly for treatment of his various ailments, Rajneesh boarded a plane on June 1, 1981, and flew from Bombay to New Jersey, where he was met by Sheela and a group of disciples. From there, he was driven across the country in a caravan of cars to the Big Muddy Ranch in Oregon. He brought with him nothing but a small suitcase containing a few changes of clothes and his collection of watches, each worth thousands of dollars. More significantly, Rajneesh brought his silence. In 1981, he had stopped giving public discourses, retreating into a period of silence that would last for nearly 5 years. From that moment forward, Sheela would be his only voice, his sole intermediary with the outside world, and with the thousands of followers who would soon descend on Oregon. The transformation of the Big Muddy Ranch into Rajneeshpuram was nothing short of extraordinary, a feat of engineering and organization that would have been impressive under any circumstances, but which seemed almost miraculous given the harsh conditions and the short time frame. Word went out to sannyasins around the world through a newsletter published by the commune. Come to Oregon, bring your skills, bring your money, bring your devotion. Come help us build a new world. They came by the thousands, drawn by the promise of being part of something larger than themselves, something revolutionary. Engineers from Germany, nurses from Australia, carpenters from California, teachers from England, software programmers from Japan. They arrived in Greyhound buses and battered Volkswagen vans, in luxury cars and on motorcycles, carrying backpacks and sleeping bags, tools and savings accounts, ready to build utopia in the desert. Sheela was everywhere, a blur of maroon robes and relentless energy, overseeing everything. She worked 18-hour days, barely slept, surviving on black coffee and cigarettes and sheer force of will. She drove herself and others with an intensity that was both inspiring and exhausting. In the early days, everyone lived in tents pitched on the dusty ground, hundreds of tents scattered across the property like a refugee camp. They ate meals cooked over propane camp stoves, rice and lentils, and vegetables bought in bulk from suppliers in Portland, served on paper plates because there was no running water to wash dishes. They used portable toilets that had to be emptied every day, a job that rotated among the residents and which no one, not even Sheela, was exempt from. The work was backbreaking. They dug trenches for water pipes, using picks and shovels because there was no heavy machinery in those first months. They poured concrete for foundations, mixing it by hand in wheelbarrows. They erected wooden frames for buildings, hammering nails in the blazing summer heat that could reach 105 degrees. By hand, with determination and sweat and blistered palms, they carved roads into the hillsides, roads that would later be paved and named with whimsical names like Nirvana Lane and Enlightenment Drive. Sheela moved among the work crews like a general inspecting troops, and there was no mistaking her authority. She wore the same maroon robes as everyone else, practical cotton that got dusty and torn and had to be patched, but her presence commanded attention. When she spoke, people stopped what they were doing and listened. When she gave an order, people obeyed without question. Those who worked with her during this period describe her as brilliant and terrifying in equal measure. She had this way of looking at you, one former sannyasin named Krishna Deva recalled in an interview with a documentary filmmaker years later, his voice still tinged with a mixture of admiration and fear. Like she could see right through to your bones, like she knew exactly what you were thinking, and whether you were giving your all or just phoning it in. And if she decided you weren't pulling your weight, God help you. She'd call you out in front of everyone, dress you down until you wanted to crawl into a hole and die. She'd say things like, "Is this the best you can do? Because if it is, maybe you should go back to wherever you came from." But if you did your job, if you showed her you were committed, if you worked until your hands bled, she'd move heaven and earth for you. She'd make sure you got the best tent, the warmest sleeping bag, the extra rations of food. Within 3 years, by 1984, they had built a city where there had been nothing but sagebrush and dust. Rajneeshpuram had paved roads that stretched for miles, smooth asphalt that was a marvel to drive on after months of rutted dirt tracks. It had a fire department housed in a custom-built station, with 3 fire trucks painted maroon to match the residents' robes. It had a police force called the Peace Force, officers armed with semi-automatic weapons and dressed in uniforms that wouldn't have looked out of place in a small-town American police department, except for the color. It had restaurants serving gourmet vegetarian cuisine, including Magdalena Cafeteria, which could seat 500 people and served 3 meals a day, and Zorba the Buddha, a shopping mall that sold everything from Levi's jeans to Indian jewelry to organic produce grown in the commune's own greenhouses. There were rows of townhouses with names like Ramakrishna and Kabir, each housing 4 to 6 residents, with shared kitchens and living rooms. There was a 4,200-foot airstrip that could accommodate private jets, and Rajneesh himself owned a collection of aircraft that he used to travel to speaking engagements before his period of silence. There was a public transportation system using maroon-painted buses that ran on a regular schedule, ferrying residents from the residential areas to the work sites to the meditation hall. There was a sewage treatment plant that recycled wastewater for irrigation, a technological marvel that won praise even from environmental groups that opposed the commune on other grounds. There was a reservoir that held 3,050 million gallons of water, created by damming a small creek, and which allowed the commune to grow crops and sustain thousands of residents in a landscape where water was scarce. And there was even a post office with its own zip code, 97741, a fact that Sheela announced with pride during a press conference, pointing out that Rajneeshpuram was now officially recognized by the United States government as a legitimate city. At its peak, Rajneeshpuram housed between 2,000 and 7,000 people, depending on the season. During the annual summer festival, a week-long celebration of Rajneesh's teachings that featured music and dancing and marathon meditation sessions, the population swelled to 15,000, making it temporarily one of the larger cities in Oregon. It was a functioning city in the middle of nowhere, complete with its own economy, its own laws, its own culture. And it was a testament to what human beings could accomplish when they worked together with a common purpose, driven by a charismatic leader and organized by a woman who would not accept failure. But from the very beginning, Rajneeshpuram faced opposition from the local community, an opposition that would grow into open hostility and which Sheela would come to see as an existential threat requiring extreme measures to combat. The residents of Wasco County, a sparsely populated rural area where most people had lived for generations, where families knew each other's names, and where the rhythms of life were dictated by the seasons and the cattle market, were alarmed by the sudden arrival of thousands of outsiders who dressed in strange robes, spoke with foreign accents, and seemed intent on taking over the region. The nearby town of Antelope, with a population of fewer than 50 people, A single main street with a post office, a school, and a handful of houses became a focal point of conflict. Sannyasins began buying properties in Antelope, moving in, registering to vote. The longtime residents watched with growing alarm as their town was transformed. By 1982, the Sannyasins had enough votes to elect a Sannyasin mayor, a woman named Krishna Deva, and a Sannyasin majority city council. They promptly voted to rename the town from Antelope to Rajneesh. The post office sign that had read Antelope, Oregon, population 40, was replaced with one that read City of Rajneesh. The school was renamed Rajneesh International Meditation University. For the locals, it felt like an invasion, a hostile takeover of their home by a group of fanatics who had no respect for their way of life or their history. Margaret Hill, the former mayor who lost her seat in the election, stood on her front porch one afternoon in the fall of 1982 and watched as Sannyasins walked past her house, laughing and speaking in languages she didn't understand. "They took our town," she told a reporter from the Oregonian, who had driven out to Antelope to cover the story, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and grief, her hands gripping the porch railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. "They came in with their money and their votes, and they took it away from us. This was our home. My parents lived here. My grandparents are buried in the cemetery up the road. And now it doesn't even have the same name. It's like they erased us." The reporter asked if she planned to move away, and Margaret shook her head. "This is my home. I'm not leaving, but I don't recognize it anymore." The state and county governments, recognizing the potential for conflict and concerned about the legal and constitutional issues raised by Rajneeshpuram's incorporation, began to push back against the commune. Oregon's Attorney General, Dave Frohnmeyer, filed a lawsuit in 1983 seeking to disincorporate Rajneeshpuram on the grounds that it violated the constitutional separation of church and state. The argument was that the city was explicitly religious in nature, governed by the followers of a specific spiritual teacher, and therefore could not be recognized as a legitimate municipality. The Wasco County Planning Department denied building permits for new construction at Rajneeshpuram, citing violations of land use laws that designated the property for agricultural use only, not for urban development. 1,000 Friends of Oregon, a powerful environmental advocacy group with deep connections to the state's political establishment, joined the legal fight, arguing that the ranch was zoned for agriculture and couldn't be developed as a city without violating Oregon's strict land use laws. For Sheela, this opposition was not just a legal nuisance. It was persecution, bigotry, an attack on people who were different, who dared to live outside the norms of conventional society. And she responded with a defiance that was as public as it was profane. She held press conferences on the steps of Rajneesh Mandir, the meditation hall that could seat 2,000 people and which had been built in the style of an Indian temple with soaring ceilings and marble floors. She stood at the podium, microphones thrust in her face, television cameras rolling, and she cursed out reporters with a ferocity that made national news and turned her into a cultural phenomenon. "Fuck off," she told a journalist from KGW television who asked about allegations of immigration fraud, her eyes flashing with anger, her voice rising. "You people come here with your prejudices and your ignorance, and you ask stupid questions. We are building something beautiful here. We are trying to live in peace, and all you want to do is tear us down." The clip played on the evening news across the country, and suddenly Ma Anand Sheela became infamous, not just in Oregon, but nationally. She was the foul-mouthed cult leader who didn't take shit from anyone, the woman who told Middle America exactly what she thought of them. Some found her refreshing. a breath of honesty in a world of political doublespeak. Others found her appalling, evidence of everything that was wrong with the commune and its values. Behind the scenes, away from the cameras and the press conferences, Sheela was becoming increasingly paranoid and willing to cross lines that even some in her inner circle found troubling. She established a surveillance system that would have impressed the Stasi, bugging the homes and offices of sannyasins to monitor their conversations for signs of disloyalty or dissent. She hired technicians who installed listening devices in the telephone lines, in the walls of the townhouses, in the offices where the commune's business was conducted. She listened to tapes of these conversations late at night in her private office, headphones on, taking notes on who was complaining, who was questioning her decisions, who might be a threat. She created the Peace Force, ostensibly a security detail to protect Rajneeshpuram from hostile locals, but in reality, a paramilitary organization that enforced her will. The Peace Force officers were armed with AR-15 rifles, 9mm pistols, and wore uniforms complete with badges and patches. They patrolled the commune in jeeps, stopping residents for questioning, searching vehicles for contraband, which could mean anything from alcohol, which was banned, to letters sent to family members outside without Sheela's approval. She surrounded herself with a small group of women who were fiercely loyal to her, women who would carry out her orders without question. There was Ma Anand Sheela, a Filipino nurse with medical training, who would later become central to the Bioterror plot. There was Ma Yoga Vidya, who ran the Rajneesh Hotel in Portland and handled relationships with local politicians and business leaders. There was Ma Ava, who managed the commune's finances and kept track of the millions of dollars flowing in from wealthy sannyasins around the world. Together, they formed what became known within the commune as the Gang, and they ran Rajneeshpuram like a police state, and anyone who questioned Sheela's authority risked being expelled from the commune or worse. In 1984, as legal challenges to Rajneeshpuram's existence mounted, and the commune faced the very real possibility of being disbanded by court order, Sheela and her inner circle devised a plan that would shock the nation and secure Sheela's place in the annals of American crime. Wasco County was scheduled to hold elections in November 1984, and the outcome of those elections could determine the fate of Rajneeshpuram. If sympathetic candidates were elected to the county commission, the commune might be able to secure the legal protections it needed to survive. But the sannyasins, despite their numbers at Rajneeshpuram, were still outnumbered by the local population in Wasco County as a whole. Their chances of winning a fair election were slim to none. Sheela's solution was as audacious as it was horrifying. If they couldn't win by increasing their own votes, they would win by suppressing the opposition's. The plan was to make the local population too sick to vote. In late August 1984, in a small laboratory that had been set up in the Pythagoras Clinic at Rajneeshpuram, a medical facility that served the commune's residents, Ma Anand Sheela began cultivating salmonella bacteria. She had ordered the salmonella typhimurium strain from a scientific supply company called VWR, claiming in the purchase order that it was needed for medical research purposes. The order raised no red flags. Over the course of several weeks, working late at night when the clinic was empty, Sheela grew the bacteria in petri dishes, feeding it with agar and nutrients, carefully maintaining the temperature and conditions necessary for the bacteria to multiply. She wore a white lab coat and rubber gloves, following proper laboratory procedures, and she kept meticulous notes on the growth rates and viability of the cultures. By early September, she had produced enough liquid salmonella to carry out the attack. The bacteria was stored in several glass vials, each containing about 50 milliliters of liquid, teeming with billions of salmonella cells. On the morning of September 9th, 1984, Sheela, Pooja, and 2 other members of the inner circle, whose names would later be revealed in court documents as Ma Shanti Bhadra and Ma Ava, drove the 40 miles from Rajneeshpuram to the Dalles, the county seat of Wasco County. They brought with them the vials of liquid salmonella, hidden in a brown paper bag that Pooja carried on her lap in the back seat. The drive took about an hour, winding through the high desert landscape, past cattle ranches and wheat fields, past the John Day River with its muddy banks and sparse vegetation. They arrived in the Dalles just after noon, and their first target was Shakey's Pizza Parlor on West 6th Street, a family restaurant popular with locals. Sheela and Pooja walked in together, dressed in civilian clothes, jeans and t-shirts, not the maroon robes that would have identified them immediately as sannyasins. The lunch rush was in full swing. The restaurant was crowded with families, with workers from the nearby aluminum plant, with teenagers cutting class. The salad bar was busy, people loading their plates with iceberg lettuce, sliced tomatoes, cucumbers, chickpeas, and dressings in squeeze bottles. Pooja approached the salad bar, her hand slipping into her jacket pocket where she'd hidden one of the vials. Sheela stood nearby, blocking the view, pretending to examine the pizza menu posted on the wall. In one smooth motion, Pooja unscrewed the cap of the vial and poured the liquid salmonella into the blue cheese dressing container, stirring it quickly with a spoon from the salad bar. No one noticed. The whole operation took less than 30 seconds. They left the restaurant, got back in their car, and drove to the next target. Over the next 2 weeks, Sheela and her team contaminated salad bars at 10 different restaurants and food establishments in the Dalles. Shakey's Pizza, Taco Time, the Portage Inn, Skipper's Seafood and Chowder House, the Lotus Cafe, the Jolly Roger Restaurant, Zartik's Pizza, the Townhouse Restaurant, the salad bar at the Albertsons Supermarket, and the produce section at the grocery store. Each time, they used the same method. Walk in, wait for a moment when no one was watching, pour the bacteria into salad dressings, or sprinkle it on vegetables, leave. The results were catastrophic. By September 17th, patients started showing up at Mid-Columbia Medical Center with acute gastroenteritis. The symptoms were severe: violent diarrhea, vomiting, fever, abdominal cramps so intense that some patients thought they were having appendicitis, or even heart attacks. Within days, the hospital was overwhelmed. 751 people fell ill with salmonella poisoning, the largest outbreak of salmonella in Oregon history, and one of the largest in the entire United States. 45 people were hospitalized, some in critical condition. An elderly woman named Dorothy Thompson nearly died from dehydration and had to be airlifted to a hospital in Portland. A 6-year-old boy spent a week in intensive care. Victims described the experience as the worst illness of their lives. Health officials scrambled to determine the cause. Dr. Michael Skeels, the state epidemiologist, traveled to the Dalles and began interviewing patients, trying to find a common link. The pattern was clear. Almost everyone who got sick had eaten at one of the contaminated salad bars, but no one suspected foul play. The assumption was that it was a natural outbreak, perhaps caused by contaminated food supplies, maybe a bad batch of lettuce or tomatoes from a distributor. Health inspectors closed the affected restaurants, tested the food, sanitized the facilities. But the source of the contamination remained a mystery. For Sheela and her co-conspirators, the attack was a tactical success, or so they believed at the time. They had demonstrated that they could strike at their enemies without being caught. that they had the will and the means to do whatever was necessary to protect Rajneeshpuram. But the attack also marked a turning point, the moment when Sheela's devotion to Rajneesh and her determination to build utopia crossed over into something far darker, something that could no longer be justified by any appeal to higher purpose or revolutionary ideals. The Bioterror attack was not an isolated incident, not an aberration born of desperation. In the months that followed, Sheela and her inner circle engaged in a series of increasingly reckless and criminal activities that would eventually bring the entire edifice of Rajneeshpuram crashing down. They attempted to assassinate Charles Turner, the United States Attorney for Oregon, who was leading the federal investigation into the commune. The plan was to inject him with a poison-filled syringe during a public event at the Portland International Airport, where Turner was scheduled to give a speech. Ma Anand, drawing on her nursing training, purchased a fast-acting poison and practiced the injection technique on pieces of fruit, perfecting the quick jab that would deliver the toxin without Turner noticing until it was too late. But on the day of the attempt, Turner's security detail was tighter than expected, and the assassins couldn't get close enough. The plan was aborted. They plotted to murder Swami Devaraj, Rajneesh's personal physician, who had begun to express doubts about Sheela's leadership and who knew too many of the commune's secrets. They prepared a poison-laced beer and left it in Devaraj's refrigerator, but he never drank it, perhaps warned by some instinct for self-preservation. They wiretapped phones throughout Rajneeshpuram, including the telephone in Rajneesh's own residence, a shocking violation that Rajneesh himself would later cite as evidence of Sheela's betrayal. They bugged his bedroom, his office, listening to his private conversations, his phone calls with his family in India, his discussions with his inner circle of advisors. They committed immigration fraud on a massive scale, arranging dozens of sham marriages between American sannyasins and foreign followers to help the foreigners obtain green cards and work permits. They set fire to the Wasco County Planning Office in the Dalles on the night of April 18, 1984, destroying records related to Rajneeshpuram's land use applications and building permits. Each of these actions was justified, in Sheela's mind, as necessary to protect the community, to defend Rajneesh, to ensure the survival of the dream they were building in the Oregon desert. By the summer of 1985, the weight of these crimes and the enormous pressure of running a city of thousands while fending off legal attacks from multiple fronts were taking a visible toll on Sheela. She was exhausted, sleeping only 3 or 4 hours a night, surviving on coffee and cigarettes and adrenaline. She was paranoid, seeing enemies everywhere, convinced that the government was planning a raid, that spies had infiltrated the commune, that even some of her closest allies were plotting against her. She was increasingly isolated, even within her own inner circle, snapping at people who had been loyal to her for years, making decisions without consultation, refusing to listen to advice. Rajneesh, who had broken his silence in 1984 and resumed giving daily discourses in the meditation hall, was beginning to undermine Sheela's position. He was speaking directly to the community again, and his presence diminished Sheela's role as the sole conduit to his will. There were rumors of tensions between them, of arguments behind closed doors. Some sannyasins claimed to have overheard shouting matches in which Sheela accused Rajneesh of not supporting her enough, of not backing her up in public, and Rajneesh accusing Sheela of exceeding her authority, of making decisions without his approval. On September 14, 1985, Sheela made a decision that would change everything. Without warning, without any announcement to the community, she and a small group of her closest followers, including Ma Anand, Ma Shanti Bhadra, and Ma Yoga Vidya, boarded a plane at the Rajneeshpuram airstrip, and flew to Germany. It was a sudden and shocking departure, and it left the commune in chaos. Residents woke up on September 15th to find that Sheela was gone, that her inner circle was gone, and that no one knew where they had gone or if they were coming back. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said Sheela had been called away on urgent business. Others said she had fled because she knew the authorities were closing in. Still others believed that Rajneesh had forced her out, that there had been a final, irreparable falling out between them. 2 days later, on September 16th, 1985, the truth began to emerge. Rajneesh held a press conference, standing on the steps of Rajneesh Mandir in his characteristic white robes and wool hat, his face grave. A crowd of sannyasins and reporters gathered in front of him, and the silence was tense. When Rajneesh spoke, his voice was calm, almost detached, but his words were explosive. "Sheela and her gang have been systematically poisoning people," he said, pausing to let the words sink in. "They have bugged my own house. They have stolen millions of dollars from the commune. They have committed crimes that I knew nothing about. They have created a fascist regime within this community. And I want them to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I am cooperating with the authorities, and I urge anyone with information about these crimes to come forward." For those who had devoted their lives to following Rajneesh, who had trusted Sheela because they believed she was acting on his behalf, who had built Rajneeshpuram with their own hands because they thought they were creating something sacred, the revelations were devastating. Many felt betrayed, not just by Sheela, but by Rajneesh himself, who had allowed her to wield such enormous power for so long, and who had said nothing, done nothing, until it was too late. The press conference marked the beginning of the end for Rajneeshpuram, and within weeks, the entire structure that Sheela had built would collapse like a house of cards. The legal consequences came swiftly and with brutal efficiency. On October 28, 1985, just 6 weeks after fleeing Oregon, Sheela was arrested in a luxury hotel in Bad Schonau, a small spa town in West Germany near the Austrian border. German police, acting on an extradition request from the United States Department of Justice, knocked on her hotel room door at 6 in the morning. Sheela answered in her bathrobe, and according to the police report filed later, she showed no surprise, no resistance. "I've been expecting you," she said calmly, and allowed herself to be handcuffed and led away. She was held in a German jail for several weeks while extradition proceedings played out, and then in December 1985 she was flown back to the United States, landing at Portland International Airport in handcuffs and leg shackles, flanked by federal marshals. On July 22, 1986, Sheela appeared in federal court in Portland, and the woman who stood before Judge Edward Levy bore little resemblance to the defiant, foul-mouthed spokesperson who had dominated headlines just a year earlier. She wore a simple gray dress that hung loosely on her frame. She had lost weight in jail, and her hair, which she had always worn long and flowing, was pulled back in a severe bun. Her face showed none of the defiance that had made her infamous. Instead, she looked tired, diminished, almost fragile. Sheela pleaded guilty to a litany of charges that read like something out of a spy thriller. Attempted murder of Charles Turner, the U.S. attorney. First-degree assault for the poisoning of 2 Wasco County commissioners. Arson for the fire at the county planning office. Wiretapping for the illegal surveillance of Rajneesh and other sannyasins. Immigration fraud for the sham marriages. The evidence against her was overwhelming, compiled through months of investigation by the FBI, the Oregon State Police, and federal prosecutors. Members of her inner circle, including Ma Anand Sheela, had been granted immunity in exchange for their testimony, and they had provided detailed accounts of the crimes, describing planning meetings, rehearsals of the assassination attempts, the cultivation of the salmonella bacteria. Judge Edward Levy, a stern, gray-haired man who had served on the federal bench for 20 years and who had presided over cases involving organized crime and domestic terrorism, listened to the prosecutor's presentation with a grim expression. When it came time for sentencing, he looked directly at Sheela, and his voice was cold. "You have committed crimes that are among the most serious this court has ever encountered," he said. "You poisoned hundreds of innocent people. You attempted to murder a federal law enforcement officer. You created an atmosphere of fear and intimidation within your own community. You have demonstrated a callous disregard for human life and for the rule of law. You have betrayed the trust of those who believed in you, and you have brought shame on a community that once held such promise." He sentenced her to 20 years in federal prison, though the sentence would later be reduced for good behavior and time served. Sheela's lawyers, a team of public defenders who had argued that she had been acting under the influence of Rajneesh, that she had believed she was protecting the commune, that she deserved leniency because she had been manipulated, stood silent. But Sheela herself, when given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, said only this, her voice barely above a whisper: "I did what I believed was necessary to protect my people and my master. I have no regrets." It was a statement that would define her public persona for decades to come, a refusal to fully acknowledge the harm she had done, a clinging to the belief that her actions had been justified by the circumstances and by her devotion to Rajneesh. Sheela served 29 months of her sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California, a medium-security facility that housed female inmates and which was located about 30 miles east of San Francisco. By all accounts from prison officials and fellow inmates who were later interviewed by journalists, Sheela adapted to prison life with the same determination and resilience that had characterized her time at Rajneeshpuram. She worked in the prison library, organizing books, helping other inmates with literacy programs, teaching English as a second language to Spanish-speaking women. She took college courses through a correspondence program, studying psychology and philosophy. She formed relationships with other inmates, particularly women who, like her, were serving time for crimes committed in the context of relationships with controlling men. She became close with some of the prison staff, including a counselor named Patricia Martinez, who would later say in an interview that Sheela was one of the most intelligent and complex women I ever met. She could be kind and compassionate, helping other inmates, teaching them to read. But she also had this wall around her, this refusal to really examine what she had done and why. In interviews conducted years later, sitting in her nursing home office in Switzerland, Sheela would describe her time in prison as a period of reflection, a time when she was able to step back from the chaos of Rajneeshpuram and think about what had happened and why. But she also maintained, with that same stubborn defiance, that she did not feel like a prisoner. "I was freer in many ways than the guards who watched over me," she said, "because I could speak my mind. I could make my own choices. I was not bound by their rules in my heart." In 1988, after serving 29 months and earning early release for good behavior, Sheela was released from Dublin and was immediately handed over to immigration authorities. The United States government had no further use for Ma Anand Sheela, and she was deported, first to West Germany, where she had been arrested, and from there, she eventually made her way to Switzerland, where she would settle permanently. The country that had once welcomed her with such hope, the America that Mark had shown her all those years ago in Montclair, now expelled her with prejudice banning her from ever returning. Rajneesh himself did not escape consequences. In late October 1980, just weeks after Sheela's departure, federal authorities arrested Rajneesh as he attempted to flee the country. He was charged with immigration fraud related to the sham marriages that Sheela had arranged, and after a brief legal battle, he pleaded guilty, paid a fine of $400,000, and was deported to India. He would never return to the United States. Rajneeshpuram, the city in the desert that had taken 3 years and tens of millions of dollars to build, was officially disincorporated by court order in November 1985. The property was seized by creditors and eventually sold off piece by piece. The buildings were demolished or sold to developers. The roads fell into disrepair. Within a year, the only signs that Rajneeshpuram had ever existed were a few crumbling foundations and the faded paint on street signs that still read Nirvana Lane and Enlightenment Drive. The sannyasins scattered, returning to their home countries, trying to rebuild lives that had been put on hold for the dream of utopia. For many of them, the collapse of Rajneeshpuram was the greatest tragedy of their lives, the loss of something they had believed in utterly. The story of what happened to Sheela after her release from prison and deportation is, in some ways, as remarkable as the story of Rajneeshpuram itself, a testament to human resilience, or perhaps to the ability of people to compartmentalize their past and reinvent themselves. Far from disappearing into obscurity, far from living out her days in shame and isolation, Sheela rebuilt her life in Switzerland with the same determination she had brought to building a city in the Oregon desert. She settled in Basel, where she met and married Urs Bernsteel, a fellow former sannyasin who had also left Rajneeshpuram and who had remained loyal to her despite everything. Urs was a gentle, quiet man who worked as a social worker, and by all accounts, he loved Sheela deeply. They married in 1987, shortly after her release from prison, in a small ceremony attended by a handful of friends. But tragedy struck again, as it had so many times in Sheela's life. Urs was diagnosed with AIDS, contracted from a blood transfusion he had received years earlier during a medical procedure. He died in 1992, just 5 years after their marriage. Sheela was devastated, but she did not allow herself to fall apart. She threw herself into work, as she always had when faced with unbearable pain. In the early 1990s, Sheela found work in the healthcare sector, starting as a volunteer at a nursing home for elderly residents in the small Swiss town of Maisprach, located in the canton of Basel-Landschaft. She discovered that she had a gift for caregiving, for working with the elderly and the infirm, for creating an atmosphere of dignity and compassion. In 1999, she took over the management of 2 nursing homes in Maisprach, Matrusaden, and Bapusaden, facilities that care for elderly and disabled residents, many of them with severe dementia or physical disabilities. Those who know her in Switzerland, the staff who work under her direction, the families of the residents, describe her as a dedicated and compassionate caregiver, someone who works long hours, often 14 or 15-hour days, someone who knows every resident by name, who remembers their birthdays, who sits with them when they are dying. "She is not the person you see in those old television clips," said one staff member, a Swiss nurse named Anna Keller, in an interview with a Swiss newspaper in 2019. "That angry, cursing woman. That is not who she is now. She is kind. She is patient. She takes care of people that society has forgotten." It is a far cry from the image of the fiery, confrontational woman who once stood on the steps of Rajneesh Mandir and told reporters to fuck off, and it raises difficult questions about the nature of redemption and the possibility of change. Can someone who committed such serious crimes, who caused such immense suffering, find a way to atone? Can they become a different person, or are they forever defined by their worst actions? Sheela herself seems to believe that she has moved on, that her life in Switzerland is a separate chapter, disconnected from the tumultuous years in Oregon. In interviews, and there have been many over the years, especially after the release of the Netflix documentary Wild Wild Country in 2018, she speaks about her work with the elderly with genuine warmth, describing it as fulfilling and meaningful. "I have found peace in my life now," she told an interviewer from The Guardian in 2018, sitting in the small office of her nursing home, surrounded by framed photographs of residents and certificates from Swiss healthcare authorities commending the quality of care at her facilities. "I am content with the quiet routine of caring for others. These people need me. They depend on me, and I will not let them down." But when asked about Rajneesh Puram, about the crimes she committed, about whether she feels remorse for the suffering she caused, her answers become more complicated, more defensive. She has never fully reckoned with her actions, never expressed the kind of deep, unequivocal remorse that might suggest a true transformation. Instead, she continues to frame her actions within the context of a larger conflict, to insist that she was a warrior defending her people against persecution, that she did what she had to do. "We were under attack," she said in that same Guardian interview, her voice rising slightly, the old defiance creeping back in. "The government wanted to destroy us. The local people wanted to drive us out. I was protecting Bhagwan. I was protecting our community. Yes, people got sick. Yes, I crossed lines. But we were fighting for our survival." This lack of full accountability has made Sheela a controversial figure, even decades after the events at Rajneesh Puram. When Wild Wild Country, the 6-episode Netflix documentary series directed by Chapman and McLean Way, was released in March 2018, it brought renewed attention to Sheela's story and reignited debates about how to understand her and how to judge her. The series, which featured extensive interviews with Sheela herself, with former sannyasins, with local residents of Wasco County, and with law enforcement officials who had investigated the crimes, was watched by millions of people around the world. It became a cultural phenomenon, spawning countless articles, podcasts, and discussions on social media. Reactions were deeply divided. Some viewers saw Sheela as a fascinating and complex character, a woman who had been caught up in extraordinary circumstances and who had made terrible choices, but who also possessed intelligence, charisma, and a certain dark magnetism. They were drawn to her defiance, her refusal to apologize, her insistence on speaking her truth regardless of how uncomfortable it made people. Others were appalled by her continued lack of remorse, by her refusal to fully acknowledge the harm she had caused, by the way the documentary seemed, at times, to treat her as a kind of anti-hero rather than a criminal responsible for one of the worst acts of domestic terrorism in American history. "She poisoned over 700 people," wrote one critic in a review of the series for The Atlantic. "She attempted to murder a federal prosecutor. She created a regime of fear and surveillance, and yet she sits there in her Swiss nursing home, smiling, telling the filmmakers that she has no regrets." How are we supposed to respond to that? The debate over how to understand Sheela and how to tell stories about people who do terrible things reflects larger questions about narrative, morality, and the nature of evil. Do we focus on the humanity of people like Sheela, on the factors that shaped them and the context in which they acted, in an effort to understand how ordinary people can commit extraordinary acts of violence? Or do we insist on moral clarity, on holding people accountable for their actions, and refusing to let them off the hook with explanations and excuses. There are no easy answers to these questions, and Sheila's story resists simple categorization. She is neither a monster devoid of human feeling, nor a victim entirely controlled by circumstances beyond her understanding. She is, instead, a deeply flawed human being who made catastrophic choices, and who has spent the rest of her life trying to justify those choices, to herself and to the world, with only partial success. One of the most striking aspects of Sheila's story, and one that becomes clear when examining the full arc of her life, is the role that gender played in shaping both her experience and the public's perception of her. As a woman in a position of power within a male-dominated movement, Sheela faced unique challenges and expectations. She was expected to be strong, to be a protector and a fighter, but she was also subject to scrutiny and criticism that her male counterparts did not face. Her confrontational style, her willingness to curse and to fight back verbally, was seen by many as unfeminine, as evidence of a kind of hysteria or instability. The media often portrayed her in gendered terms, calling her a shrew, a harridan, a woman out of control. One newspaper headline from 1985 read, "The Wicked Witch of Wasco County," and the accompanying article described her as a diminutive Indian woman with a sharp tongue and a taste for power that would make Lady Macbeth blush. At the same time, Sheela herself used her gender strategically, presenting herself as a fierce defender of her community, a woman who would not be silenced or intimidated by the patriarchal structures of American government and law enforcement. She claimed to be fighting for women's liberation, for the right of women to have power, and to use it without apology. "I am not going to be a good little Indian girl," she told a reporter from Time magazine in 1984. "I am not going to sit quietly and let men tell me what to do. If that makes me a bitch, then I'm a bitch." But her actions, particularly her treatment of other women within the commune, call into question the sincerity of her feminist rhetoric. She was not lifting up other women or creating systems of shared power. She was consolidating her own authority, and she was willing to destroy anyone, male or female, who stood in her way. In this sense, Sheila's story is a cautionary tale about the ways in which the language of liberation can be co-opted and twisted into a justification for oppression. She spoke the language of feminism and empowerment, but she practiced authoritarianism and control. The relationship between Sheela and Rajneesh remains one of the most enigmatic and troubling aspects of the entire Rajneesh Puram story, a relationship that has been endlessly analyzed and debated by scholars, journalists, and former sannyasins. To what extent was Rajneesh aware of and complicit in the crimes that were committed in his name? Did he order Sheela to carry out the Bioterror attack, the assassination plots, the wiretapping, the immigration fraud? Or did she act on her own initiative, believing that she was serving his interests and protecting him from threats both real and imagined? These questions have been debated endlessly, and there is no consensus, no smoking gun document or recording that definitively answers them. Rajneesh himself maintained until his death in 1990 that he knew nothing of Sheila's crimes, that she had acted without his knowledge or approval, that he was as shocked as anyone when the truth came out. In his press conference on September 16, 1985, he said, "Sheela and her gang have been doing things that I never authorized, that I never approved. She has betrayed me and betrayed this community." But many who were close to Rajneesh, who spent years in his presence, find this claim hard to believe. They point out that Rajneesh was a man of extraordinary intelligence and insight, someone who prided himself on his ability to understand human nature and to see through deception and self-delusion. It seems unlikely, they argue, that he could have been unaware of what Sheela was doing, especially given that she had direct access to him every day, that the crimes were committed in service of protecting the commune he had founded, and that some of the crimes, like the wiretapping of his own residence, directly affected him. Moreover, Rajneesh's teachings, with their emphasis on transcending conventional morality and embracing one's shadow self, on going beyond good and evil, created an ideological framework within which extreme actions could be justified. He taught his followers that guilt and shame were chains that needed to be broken, that true enlightenment required going beyond the petty moral constraints of society. He frequently spoke about the need to be ruthless in the pursuit of truth, to destroy the ego and all its attachments. In one of his discourses from 1980, recorded and later transcribed, he said, "If you want to be truly free, you must be willing to do things that society calls evil. You must be willing to break the rules, to shock people, to make them uncomfortable. Only then can you transcend the prison of morality." In such a context, it is not hard to see how someone like Sheela could convince herself that poisoning people and plotting murder were acceptable, even necessary, acts in service of a higher purpose. Some former sannyasins believe that Rajneesh used Sheela, that he deliberately cultivated her loyalty and her willingness to do his dirty work, and that he then discarded her when she became a liability, when the authorities closed in and he needed someone to blame. They point to the timing of his denunciation, which came only after Sheela had already left, and after it was clear that law enforcement was going to pursue criminal charges. If Rajneesh had truly been opposed to Sheela's actions, they argue, he could have stopped her at any time during the years when she was committing crimes. His silence during those years, they suggest, was a form of complicity, a tacit endorsement of her methods, even if he did not explicitly order specific acts. Others take a more charitable view of Rajneesh, arguing that he was a spiritual teacher, not a manager or a CEO, and that he genuinely believed in giving his followers the freedom to make their own choices, even when those choices were destructive. In this interpretation, Rajneesh's failure was not one of malice, but of naivete, a failure to recognize that his teachings could be misinterpreted and misused by those who lacked his wisdom and restraint, by people who were driven by ego and fear rather than by genuine spiritual insight. But whatever the truth of Rajneesh's involvement, and that truth may never be fully known, what is clear is that the power structure at Rajneeshpuram, with its combination of charismatic authority, vested in a silent, distant guru, and administrative control concentrated in the hands of one fiercely loyal woman, created the conditions in which Sheela's crimes became possible. She was given immense power, and she used it without adequate oversight or accountability. And when the consequences of her actions finally caught up with her, when the full extent of what she had done was revealed, it was too late to undo the damage. In the years since the collapse of Rajneeshpuram, there have been numerous attempts by scholars, journalists, and filmmakers to make sense of what happened there, to draw lessons from the story that might help prevent similar tragedies in the future. Books have been written, doctoral dissertations filed, documentaries produced, all trying to answer the question of how a community that began with such idealistic intentions, with a genuine desire to create a better way of living, could end in bioterrorism and criminal prosecution. What emerges from all of these accounts is a picture of a community that was, in many ways, genuinely utopian in its aspirations, but that was also deeply flawed in its execution. The vision of a place where people could live freely, where they could explore their spirituality and creativity without the constraints of conventional society, was compelling, and it attracted thousands of sincere seekers who believed in that vision with all their hearts. They worked themselves to exhaustion building Rajneeshpuram. They gave their money, their time, their devotion. But the vision was undermined by the authoritarianism of its leaders, by the paranoia and defensiveness that arose in response to external threats, and by the willingness of those in power to sacrifice principles in the name of expediency and survival. Rajneeshpuram became, in the end, not a utopia, but a cautionary tale about the dangers of charismatic leadership, about the ways in which noble ideals can be corrupted when they are pursued without regard for the rights and dignity of others, when the ends are allowed to justify any means. For Sheela, the legacy of Rajneeshpuram is something she continues to carry with her, a burden that she can neither fully escape nor fully accept. In her interviews and in her memoir, Don't Kill Him, The Story of My Life with Bhagwan Rajneesh, published in 2012, she returns again and again to the theme of loyalty, of devotion to a cause, and to a leader who she believed was worth fighting for. She insists that she was not a criminal, that she was a soldier in a war, that her actions were justified by the circumstances and by the persecution her community faced. "We were building something beautiful," she said in an interview in 2021 with a Swiss television network, sitting in the garden of her nursing home, surrounded by flowers she had planted herself. And they wanted to destroy it. So yes, I fought back. Yes, I did things that were illegal, but I did them to protect something precious, and I would do it again if I had to. But the more she talks, the more interviews she gives, the more it becomes clear that she is still, decades later, trying to convince herself as much as she is trying to convince others. The pain and the loss that marked her early life, the death of Mark, the death of Urs, the pressures of building and defending Rajneeshpuram, the betrayal by Rajneesh, who threw her to the wolves to save himself. All of these things have left scars that have never fully healed. And so she continues to tell her story, to defend her choices, to insist that despite everything, despite the prison time and the deportation and the infamy, she has no regrets. It is a stance that is both admirable in its defiance and deeply troubling in its refusal to fully reckon with harm caused. When asked in a 2010 interview with Netflix filmmakers what she would say to the victims of the Salmonella attack, the people who spent days or weeks in hospital beds, who lost wages because they couldn't work, who suffered pain and fear. Sheela paused for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry they got sick. That was not the intention. The intention was to protect our community. But yes, people suffered, and for that I am sorry." It was the closest she has ever come to an apology, and even then it was qualified, hedged, wrapped in justifications. And when asked what she would say to Rajneesh if she could see him again, if she could sit with him one more time, her eyes filled with tears for the first time in the interview. "I would put my head in his lap," she said, her voice breaking. "That's where my journey started, in his lap. And that's where it should end. I love him. I have always loved him, even after everything, even after he betrayed me." You don't stop loving someone just because they hurt you. In the end, Ma Anand Sheela's story is not one of redemption or of villainy, but of something more complicated and more human. It is the story of a woman who loved fiercely, who believed she was protecting her people and serving a higher purpose, and who made catastrophic choices in service to that belief. She was devoted, and she was ruthless. She was a builder and a destroyer. She was capable of great love and great cruelty, often at the same time. Her life is a reminder that the line between devotion and fanaticism is thin, that charismatic leaders can inspire both greatness and atrocity, and that the pursuit of utopia, when divorced from accountability and moral restraint, can lead to dystopia. Sheela gave everything to Rajneesh and to Rajneeshpuram, and in doing so, she became capable of acts she might never have imagined herself committing when she was that young girl in Baroda, dreaming of something larger than the life laid out before her. Whether she understands that now, whether she has truly reckoned with the full weight of what she did, remains unclear. What is clear is that the story of Ma Anand Sheela, the girl from Baroda who became the voice of a silent guru and the architect of the largest bioterror attack on American soil, will continue to fascinate and disturb for generations to come. It is a story that asks us to consider what we would do in her place, how far we would go for something we believed in, and whether we would recognize the moment when devotion turned into something darker. And those are questions that have no easy answers.